Yeah, it's my pleasure to start the program in time and also the first program of the semester. On behalf of Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, MAHE, I extended a warm welcome to our Honorary Director and Mentor, Professor MD Nalapat. And I also welcome our colleagues in the dentistry as a moderator and my colleagues and students and all others who are attending the online lecture. As you know, we have divided our Saturdays, working Saturdays into different segments. First and second Saturday we will dedicate to the presentation and the debates and discussions on pertinent issues on geopolitics by students. And fourth Saturday we will dedicate to the UNESCO Chair Lecture Series. And fifth Saturday we will keep it for the research scholars. They can present some their working themes and related themes. That's how we have designed the program. And third Saturday is a holiday, so we don't have to worry about that. And this is the first program of the semester and the calendar year. And Professor Nalapat, who is holding the UNESCO University Chair for Peace, has agreed to deliver the lecture on global efforts at counter-radicalization. And we are grateful to Professor Nalapat for this initiative and for the initiative of this semester for the lecture UNESCO Chair Lecture Series. So the topic of discussion is very relevant in the present world. Academics and policy experts are closely watching the developments related to the different types of radicalization process and trying to find solutions. The Government of India has recognized the security challenges from different types of radicalization and decided to find solutions through policy initiatives. In fact, Ministry of Home Affairs has for the first time approved a research study on status of radicalization in India. The study, which was taken up by Dr. G.S. National Law University of Delhi. He has taken up the study and has come out with some findings. And it's a major item is how to identify the radicalization. And everyone knows that it is not easy to find a solution by one country. Of course, the country has to find solution within the state, but it requires a global effort to address the problems. So how we can address the challenges coming from the cross-border terrorism, cross-border insurgency activities, and all these things has to be addressed in the global level only. So Professor Nalapat's lecture will definitely give good inputs to the discussion on counter-radicalization. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay, clear. Okay, so I'm not wasting my time of others. I welcome Professor Nalapat to the program and handing over the space for him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ravi. I'm very happy to at least address you virtually, since it's not so easy to come to the department in view of the rising number of cases, and more importantly, the protocols highlighted during the entire pandemic. Protocols which we have never seen before in any other pandemic, or frankly, in the case of diseases that are much more severe in terms of fatal consequences than COVID-19. I'd like to say that you're perfectly right, and I'm glad that you chose the subject of global response for the simple reason that, as you know, we are all aware, a lot of radicalization is connected through the World Wide Web, through the internet. Everything is a blessing, and it can be not a blessing as well. And the internet has been a huge blessing in terms of an explosion of knowledge, in terms of dissemination of ideas. It's been a huge blessing to humanity, but there have been also problems connected to the internet. And one of them is the way the internet has been used, online discourse has been used to promote concepts that are basically based on exclusion and supremacy. When you're talking about radicalization, radicalization does not accept the equality of human beings. Radicalization posits a certain group of human beings and which claim superior knowledge and which claim superior privileges and who believe that violence or any method whatsoever is justified so long as your objectives are met. Any method. I mean, you know, we all know that, as Mahatma Gandhi said, means are, after all, everything. You know, some people, he argued, talking about means and ends. But according to Gandhiji, the ends were not as important as the means. Now, I mean, there will be a lot of people who may disagree with that. He had a very, very strong view on that. But the reality is that so far as the efforts of radicalization are concerned, any means whatsoever is valid, so long as it promotes the cause of the handful of people who are involved in extremist ideology, in some, and the larger network of fringe groups. So I'm glad you talked about a global perspective, because the internet is global, the influences are global, and it's not possible to shut off the World Wide Web. I mean, efforts have been made. For example, some countries, some security agencies have basically sought to shut off the internet. But the reality is that very often does much more harm in terms of societal progress, in terms of societal cohesion, than any benefit that it may get, you may get from the avoidance of counter-radicalization measures. There is need for a targeted approach to ensure that these measures are identified correctly and dealt with. The problem that is being faced is, apart from the widespread possibility of dissemination through the internet mainly, and also through in-person discussions, small groups, etc. Well, there is another problem, and that is that a large number of people who, who talk in the language of radicalization and who talk in the language of violence, they're really not going to operationalize that particular talk. It's all talk. I mean, all of us are, guilty at some point or the other of talking without really being very serious about following through on our talk. Now, in Europe these days, in some countries in Europe, for example, in Britain, you see a lot of talk about facing the Russians, taking on the Russians, and standing by the Ukrainians no matter what. Well, guess what? None of these people who are talking about quote unquote facing the Russians or quote unquote standing by the Ukrainians, it basically mean getting involved in any battle between Ukraine and Russia. Not one of them is ever going to go anywhere near the front line. It's talk is cheap. And in the world of attempting to locate radicals, the difficulty is a lot of the people who are identified are actually all talk. They're not serious. And it's so far to come up with a toolkit by which you can winnow out the serious from the radical, from the unserious, before they actually operationalize their words and move into activities that are potentially deadly. It's that particular toolkit is under development, and to the best of my knowledge, it has not been developed very substantially yet, which is why a lot of de-radicalization programs across the world have been less than successful. Now, I think all of us have read reports, whether in the newspapers or in the journals or on television screens, of individuals who committed terrorist acts. And many of these individuals were involved in de-radicalization programs, programs that have been implemented at great expense in a range of countries across the world. Now they pass through these programs and they're given a certificate that fine, now this gentleman has been de-radicalized, he's safe to enter society. It's not just he, it's both ladies as well as gentlemen are active in this process. But the fact is that many of them, as soon as they get that kind of freedom, they start planning for an attack. So a lot of this de-radicalization effort is essentially going into preventing operational activation of radical rhetoric, which in the first place, in more than 90% of individuals indulging in that rhetoric, is never going to happen in the first place. I mean, we have seen, for example, I hate to bring this up, but I mean, I may be fighting a certain conventional wisdom here, but we have seen about talking in terms of how vaccines are 70% effective, 80% effective. Well, the reality is the human body is 70% or 80% effective against COVID. Many people are naturally immune to the disease, and many people who get the disease, they have practically no symptoms at all. So, I mean, personally, I'm not entirely sure what the science is behind identifying every such case if the person has been vaccinated to the vaccination, because even those without vaccination, a lot of them get immune to COVID and a lot of them recover quite swiftly from COVID. I'm sure vaccination is very helpful. I've taken 2 myself, and I'm not, I mean, I've been offered a booster dose, but I'm sure they're extremely helpful, many of them. But the reality of the fact is that I think it's important to understand that there is a natural immunity of the human body to a lot of these pathogens, including COVID. So if you ascribe that natural immunity to something else in an effort to try and promote that particular, I'm only saying that it then sends the whole activity into a certain degree of question marks, and it creates problems. I believe there should be vaccination. I believe everybody who wants to be vaccinated should be vaccinated. But of course, I don't believe in penalizing those who refuse to be vaccinated. The Australian Open, for example, I'm not sure we can call it the Australian Open anymore because it's an Australian closed. It's been shut out for certain players on grounds which, from the public health point of view, if you look at Australia today, it's swimming in cases. Luckily for Novak Djokovic, he was deported. Otherwise, somebody in Australia would have said, oh my God, Djokovic is playing a match, and therefore we have all these cases in Australia. You had a lot of lockdowns, you had cases. You have a lot of you have a lot of vaccines, and then you have cases. I'm only saying, when we talk of science, we don't talk of theoretical concepts, we talk of actualities, and we talk of actualities looked at realistically, logically, rationally, and entirely in terms of truth. So we're not going to try and prove something that we have already decided is the hypothesis to be correct. We're not going to try and prove our hypothesis correct. We're going to allow the facts to prove a hypothesis correct. So the sad truth is, many of these de-radicalization efforts are essentially proving hypotheses that the individuals who are behind such efforts have to be correct. And essentially that means, as in the case of pathogens where there's a lot of natural immunity, as I said, in a sense you can say more than 90% of those who spout the most absurd, extremist, radical rhetoric have no intention of carrying that to reality. So what happens? This 90% is then taken as a great success of the de-radicalization process, and the others who are part of the process, and in fact a growing number of that, they are taken as the exceptions. I mean, we saw, for example, that those who got COVID-19 after vaccination were seen as exception. Well, they multiplied so much that there seem to be a lot of exceptions to that. So all I'm trying to say is, this is a field of study where it's very important not to go in from preconceived notions of whether this is good or this is bad, and to accept certain realities. And one reality is, fortunately for us, most of us in human society have a natural immunity to the hatred, the hate mongering, the fear mongering, the extremism that we are talking about here, this radicalization that we are talking about. Essentially, radicalization, at least in my way of thinking, implies a concept of superiority of one's own belief system. And that belief system is in a very narrow, rigid format. It's not a broad-based system. It's a very narrow system. And secondly, the willingness and in fact, in the perceived desirability of using any and every method to fulfill that goal. You saw, I mean, in countries across the world, you have seen some very cruel dictatorships. You have seen efforts by countries to impose their colonial will on other people. India itself, we have seen a large number of such efforts, including, if I may say so, misrule by those who were not from outside, but from inside. Misrule can come from various forms. It can come from outside, it can come from inside. Now, you saw in Germany, for example, you had a party in Germany led by an individual who had absolutely no hesitation, no rules of the game, in basically assuming that the conclusions he drew, including some extremely, I would almost use the word obscene conclusions regarding, for example, certain faiths, no hesitation in acting as though those conclusions were accurate and in wreaking havoc across the world. Why? Because for him, the ends were everything. The means did not count at all. And this is a radical viewpoint. So you have, for example, individuals in democratic societies, I'm not going to name them, who do not want to lose a position of power that they have been elected to, and who try and cling on to that power no matter by what means, even unconstitutionally. We have seen a very large democracy in the grip of that kind of situation, in which about 30% of the population believes a free election, was somehow invalid because their candidate lost. In every election, one candidate will win, or there's a multi-member constituency, the number of people in that constituency will win, the others will lose. And you accept that. And you have instances in the past, such as, for example, Richard Nixon graciously accepting his defeat. You have Al Gore very graciously accepting his defeat. Well, frankly, George Bush came to power in the first round, according to me, through the Supreme Court of the United States. He didn't come to power because of the ballot. He came to the Supreme Court. But then you have, but even then, you had the opposing candidate sporting enough to say, okay, you came in through the justices of the court, but still I'm acknowledging in the greater interest, I'm moving out. But then you have cases where, even when there is an obvious victory of one side, and I have very often in the last few decades, if I may say so, criticized Senator Biden when he was senator for the way in which he used to basically support Pakistan. Biden, if you look at his itineraries, if you look at his statements, he has been very Pakistan friendly over the years. Fortunately, that was Senator Biden, not President Biden. But the reality is he won the election fair and square. But if you have a situation by which 1/3 of the country believes you have not won the election, then you have the grounds for another kind of radicalization. And I would like to define radicalization not just in terms of radicalization that is involving a religion or a group of religions or faiths or a group of sects, but radicalization means the willingness to use force to enforce your will and the absolute lack of any kind of reality when it comes to judging a situation and in seeking to impose your will on that situation. Now, this is what we are seeing playing out in several fora across the world. And if I may point out, at least, I would like to just throw an idea before the students of our department. I'd like to say that our department, our students, and some of whom are now your teachers, some of whom are now my colleagues, they have made amazing contributions to knowledge in this very important field of geopolitics and international relations. And I'd like to throw open the fact that when we talk about of de-radicalization, we have to talk about de-radicalization in a larger societal context. We have to talk about the different manifestations of de-radicalization. Because the problem is now, and one manifestation I just talked about was one obsessively saying that one particular method of dealing with a pandemic is the right one, and those who don't accept that method are somehow criminal, and treating them as criminals, isolating them, and subjecting them to all kinds of financial and other penalties. I don't believe that is anywhere near a democratic process. I don't believe that is a fair method. I know a particular case of a lady who had twice got severe reaction to penicillin because she's allergic to penicillin. Now, two doctors, including a dentist, somehow seemed to prescribe medicines that had penicillin by being careless about it, if I may say so. Extremely careless about it. She had the most horrible reactions, and therefore she is very, very nervous about taking the COVID vaccination. She has not taken it so far, although she has, of course, traveled abroad. She has gone to different countries that are sensible enough to accept that you can go in for protocols. You don't need to bar the doors, shut the gates. But, you know, to an extent, you can understand that. I mean, a penicillin reaction must have been a horrible event. And when it happens twice in your life, there is a certain degree of fear. And there has to be an understanding in human society. I'm glad that she has not tried to go to Australia, because judging by the way the Australians are treated, a perfectly healthy individual, Novak Djokovic, a man who has been tested and found negative, and who can be tested day and night. If you want, test Djokovic day, afternoon and night, test him 3 times. But don't deprive him the chance of this 20th Grand Slam. What you have done is a gross injustice, at least in my way of thinking. And I've been a UNESCO Peace Chair for quite some time. I am very, in a sense, in my own way, I do believe I would like to carry forward this effort at creating a climate of peace and moderation. And sometimes those who claim to be moderates are very immoderate in the way they treat people who don't agree completely with their version. The same thing goes with democracy. The same thing goes with that. If you have to accept the democratic process. You have to accept the results of the ballot. And if you don't accept the results of the ballot, even if the results are there in clear, tangible, legal, verifiable form, and then you throw a tantrum, and then you say, sorry, this is not, unless I win the election, it's not a fair election. And if I lose, it's definitely not a fair election. The last election was fair because I won. This election is not fair because I lost. Whatever our personal views about Joe Biden, whatever our views about his success or otherwise the president, he is the elected president of the United States. And to demean that and to downgrade that is also a form of radicalism. And I can tell you why I am stressing this kind of point is radicalizations, the different manifestations of radicalizations, they feed upon each other. They breed in a climate where others are significant. And this is where the radicalization, for example, of imposing your own method of solution of a pandemic on everybody by the harshest possible means, of trying to impose the candidate of your choice as the victor by any means whatever. And many of these means will be not only illegal, but illogical. Well, these are fertile grounds for different types of radicalization. If you look at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you will note that one of the problems that they've identified in the United States is what, we have long known as racial supremacy. the so-called supremacy of one race over the other. Some of us thought that, the gentleman who thought a particular race was the master race and the race that he was fighting with was the very inferior race, when that inferior race, quote unquote, completely demolished and destroyed his army, his country, and invaded and occupied his country. And frankly, if I may say so, let's be honest, about 80% of the war against Germany, more than 80%, was won by the Soviet Union. And Hitler believed that the Soviets were a quote unquote whatever. And therefore, it was inevitable that the Germans would finish them off. Well, as it happened, it did not happen. And of course, part of the reason is very generous assistance from the United States. Franklin Roosevelt, thank God you had a Roosevelt. Thank God you had a Stalin. And I must say, Churchill was awful for India. The man had the most violent prejudices for India. But as a wartime prime minister, he was ideal for Britain. And these three came together against Hitler, and especially the United States and Russia did an amazing amount of work in ensuring that this menace was dealt with. But I'd like to say again that today in the United States, this perception that an election has not been won fairly, that perception is now breeding a certain degree of, if I may say so, racial superiority. And whether you believe that you're superior because of your race, or you're superior because of your religion, or you're superior because of your lifestyle, or superior because of your diet or your dress, frankly, the reality is we are all, in a sense, the same to each other. Some of us are good at certain things, others are good at other things. I mean, there are people who may not know, at least some people believe that I do know a little bit of geopolitics here and there. But I'm sure some other people may feel that I do not. But there are people who may not know as much geopolitics as I'm supposed to know, but who know other things which I know nothing. So who am I to say that because I know one particular field and they don't, I am better than they are? I'm not. In the same way, all of us, we know certain fields, we don't know other fields. And we're not better or worse than anybody else, because humanity has got to be complementary. We've got to work together. And the radicals are those who refuse to accept that, who refuse to accept the power of fusion. I mean, we have all been trying very hard to look at a world where you have nuclear fusion. And if you have nuclear fusion, you have cheap power, you have cheap energy. It's a grand kind of vista, but it's not happened yet. But that fusion is so important, and radicals reject fusion. They want exclusivity. They have got absurd notions of themselves, and historical experience means nothing to them. Absurd notions of themselves. Now, I mean, sometimes in some cases, for example, in Germany, some of the most talented German citizens, some of the most brilliant and productive German citizens were sought to be eliminated from society in Germany and society in Europe. I mean, it was done in a very cold-blooded, calculating manner. So I'm not going to call it an act of insanity, but it was an act of undiluted hatred and radicalism. I have not seen any kind of radicalism that can compare, for example, with the radicalization that took place in South America, for example, when conquerors came from other parts of the world, and then they dealt with the indigenous people there. Or for example, in North America, handing over blankets filled with smallpox to the Indians there, to the American Indians, knowing that will kill them off completely. Now, I would like to say this is also radicalization. Racial supremacy is radicalization. Religious supremacy is radicalization. And when we talk about radicalization, and we talk only of one segment of this percept that of religious supremacy, that I know the path to heaven. There's no other path to heaven except the path that I believe is real. And anybody who does not follow that path is going to land up in hell. Well, that remains to be seen, because the reality is, unless you actually go there before the day of judgment, you're not going to know whether it's heaven or hell or nirvana or moksha or whatever. It's not going to happen. And no one has come back to give us the experience. But I'd like to say, therefore, let's have a slightly broader vision of radicalism, because it's very important to protect human society from radicalization in the broad framework in which I'm talking about it. It's not just enough to say we are against, for example, the kind of terrorism that we saw in 9/11, in 26/11, but then when we talk and then at the same time go on television and say, no, Joe Biden, lost the election, or go on television, and if there is a political leader that you do not like, whatever that political leader does is wrong. Whatever he or she does is wrong, no matter what. It may be things that you yourself have wanted to do, that you have said that you should do, but because X is doing it, it's wrong. That's also radicalization. That's also a very radical view. You have to take a stand on any political leader based on what you believe is doing, he or she is doing right or wrong. If everything that the individual does is wrong, as for example you're seeing happen in some very big democracies, that certain political parties say whatever X party does is wrong, whatever my party does is right, and that party says whatever this party does is wrong, whatever my party does is right. Well, that kind of thing, frankly, will tear up democracy and will promote a culture of radicalization, which will also bring in the kinds of radicalizations, the narrow radicalizations that we're talking about. Because radicals, they thrive in an atmosphere of hate. They shrivel and shrink in an atmosphere of moderation, in an atmosphere of acceptance, in an atmosphere where there is no exclusivity. And I'd like to say very clearly that it's not just a question of a de-radicalization program, which, as I told you, most of the people who are involved in that program were never going to be operational in the first place. So coming back and saying out of 100 people, 90 are not operational because of our program. Well, these at least 90 would never have been operational in the first place. So personally, I'm a bit of a skeptic about many of these de-radicalization programs. You saw in India, for example, there was an effort at a national party joining hands with the state party in a particular part of the country where Pakistan has been giving a lot of attention to destabilize. Some of us were opposed to that in the very beginning because the philosophies of these two parties were completely dissimilar. But the belief was that somehow there could be a coming together of these two elements. And as a consequence, what would happen is that there would be a transfer of moderation to one side. Instead of what happened was, there was in fact an incentivization to radicalization, and that has created a lot of problems for people of that state. Fortunately, that error has been recognized and rectified. But my point is, let's not have any false illusions about who's a radical, who's not a radical. And I would like to open the floor to questions. So I'm not going to take much more time on my views on this matter. But I'd like to point out one problem that we have got in identifying the maybe 10%, maybe 6%, whatever, who are really radical. And when I say really radical, I mean operationally radical. Not people who talk radicalization, but people who are willing to not only talk, but act radical. And my worry is a lot of these people, and believe me, I've come in touch with radicals, I've come in touch with counter-radical programs across the world, not just in India, but in different countries, including the Middle East, including in North America, including in Europe. And the worry is that oftentimes the radicals are experts at camouflaging themselves. So you have, for example, people who planned out 9/11. Many of them, if you went to their homes, they were quite normal people in the sense of they never talked about this kind of what they were going to do, what they had in their minds. They had normal, almost normal, their lifestyles. Many of them, for example, indulged in activities which by logical, the conventional wisdom, radicals would not do. Many of them drank alcohol. Many of them socialized. Quite gregariously they socialized. You would never believe, looking at them, that they were so radical inside. And yet, these are the people who were the most radical and who carried out some of the most audacious radical acts ever. So I'd only like to say that it's not an easy process. I would love to come and give you a set of answers, like, for example, medication for getting rid of a particular problem. I mean, let's say, penicillin, it cures certain diseases. You had tuberculosis, it then got cured. You had leprosy, and then dapsone came along, and leprosy was no longer the killer it was. But I don't think that we have discovered that kind of a killer antibody or a killer, if I may say so. We have a killer medicine, a medication for the radicalization. What we need are antibodies. And that antibody means accepting the horizontality of society, something I've been talking about for a long time. I remember long back in Barlan University, I wrote a paper about that. I think Dr. Jairam here has probably got access to that paper. It's very important for us to understand that antibodies have got to be created in the human body, in the human mind, to show why working together is the only answer for stability, for progress, for a good life. If you want a good life, if you want your family to have a good life, if you want a certain degree of stability in society, if you want progress, including in technology, you have to accept the reality of an inclusive society. So you have countries now across the world that are inclusive, and you have, for example, in the Western world now, Indians are very welcome as immigrants. Why? Because they realize that these are, many of, they bring with them a lot of talents, and overall you'll see the Indian citizen is among the, in terms of per capita, they pay the highest volume of taxes, they have the least charge on social services, and they are credits to their society. So you have, the other day I was invited to give a kind of it had to be virtual, to the American Association of Physicists or Physicians of Indian origin. And because I'm very much an admirer of that group. Doctors in the United States, doctors in the UK, they have changed the perception of India. You had so many perceptions about India, whereas when you had doctors going in there and healing people and curing people, and immediately, and they were Indian, it changed perceptions. When we used to visit the United States, after a large number of doctors came from India, I can assure you I was treated with much greater respect by the border control authorities than was the case. Oh, you're Indian. Are you a doctor? Well, regrettably, if I had even kept quiet, he would have said, I've got these symptoms, what can I do for you? What should I do? But the reality is that so much of change came because of the way in which our people function. And they're welcome in society. You have societies where you have glass ceilings based on race, based on religion, based on clan, based on other issues, income as well. And wherever you have these glass ceilings, you are actually holding back progress. These glass ceilings must go, including gender ceilings, including income ceilings, including ethnic and religious and other ceilings. They have to go. And when you talk of de-radicalization, let's admit, in each of our minds, there's a radical element in each of our minds. We are all radical in some way or the other. And therefore, in some way or the other, we are being less than fair to humanity and to the what do I say, the ideals of humanity and a humane society. So when you're looking at de-radicalization, please, let's look inwards as well. All of us, myself, yourself, I mean, almost all the citizens, people that any of us will run into, there is a radical element. And I define this radical element as two things. One, an unshaken belief, no matter what the facts, that you are right and the other is completely wrong. And two, a willingness to go the extra mile in basically promoting that belief. Of course, fortunately for almost all of us, it does not involve violence, but it does sometimes involve strong argument. It does sometimes involve fights in which you break away from, your societal groups. You create animosities, sometimes lifelong animosities. Well, the fact is, this is also radicalization. I want to end on a hopeful note and saying that when we are talking about a narrow definition of radicalization, and that is a radicalization caused by efforts at, certain sects claiming a kind of superiority over everything else, the whole world is now aware of that. The reality is, leaders across the world are becoming aware of the reality that we are in a small little planet. Planet Earth is a very tiny speck in the solar system. And we are multiplying rapidly as a result of technology and whatever other things. And we have to live on this planet. I think it's going to be a while before you can settle on other planets. It's going to be a while, So as a consequence, what is happening is that there is a perception, frankly, that you need that kind of thing. And now in the Middle East, I'm very heartened to see that in Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and if you look at my writings, we look at my public talks, from the beginning, I have been very happy to see that, that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has broken away from Wahhabism, which was the bedrock foundation of the Al Saud dynasty. The first Al Saud to break away from Wahhabism and introduce reforms, which from the view, which is causing a lot of tension and anger against him, and which is causing a very substantial, well-funded Wahhabi lobby across the world to demonize him and to demonize his experiment that he is conducting. But he is persevering in that, and I'm happy about that. Look at the UAE. The UAE has permitted a temple to be set up there. Now you have some, frankly, people who I think are possibly, need to get some medical assistance in terms of some to check. And this means that they're turning away from Islam. No, this means that they're moving to the real Islam, to the modern, moderate Islam. As Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, essentially the core of all these faiths is modern and moderate. And they're turning to Islam, the real Islam, by allowing temples and by ensuring that women, for example, are given the same rights as men. They're not turning away except from hateful sects that do not represent faiths at all. So I'd only like to end on a note that more and more people are beginning to accept that. More and more people are getting isolated. At the same time, in other kinds of radicalization, such as the political radicalization I'm talking about, such as some efforts by some countries to dominate the rest of the world that we have been discussing often, that radicalization is growing. And therefore, when we talk about this problem, we have to talk about all these radicalizations, because eventually all of them affect us as part of common humanity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. That was once again a great pleasure to listen to you on a topic that is so relevant, as Ravi sir mentioned in the beginning. To talk about counter-radicalization is not easy, because there's not a particular toolkit that everybody can follow. So thank you so much once again. And I also want to reiterate that this is just one among several lectures that we are planning to organize this year as part of the UNESCO Peace Chair's mandate to promote peace and non-violence, not just in India, but also across the world. In fact, since 1999, this chair has been very active in peace-related activities in various parts of the world, and our department in particular has also contributed to such efforts by organizing several Track 2 dialogue to promote greater understanding between countries. So as the chairholder, Professor Nalapat has probably contributed the most to these efforts, and it's always a happy occasion to be part of these efforts overall. So now I open the space for questions and by our students and other guests who have joined from outside as well. So yeah, we have one question here, Gargi. You may go ahead.
Good morning, sir. It was an enlightening lecture. It is a real pleasure to listen to you. I'm Gargi, a second-year student at the department. So, in the context of India's latest statement at UN regarding religiophobia against non-Abrahamic religions, I personally had these two questions to ask. So, has India taken any steps to tackle political Islam? If not, how do you think India should approach this radical threat of religious supremacy? This is my first question. And second is, in one of your decade-old articles, like it's from 2008, you had written that India is a weak link in the counter-terror chain. Do you still think the same, sir? Thank you.
I'm sorry, Gargi, would you kindly repeat your second question? There was some garbling because of my internet problem. Please go ahead. The second part of your question.
My second question is, I read one of your decade-old articles from 2008 in which you had written India as a weak link in the counter-terror chain. So do you still think the same, sir?
Well, look, I'd like to make one point very clear, and that is that I am very happy that this entire effort at combating, that this effort at separating Abrahamic from non-Abrahamic religions is frankly, if I would like to say the whole world is Sanatani. And when you talk of Sanatanis, it means you have multiple paths to the same objective of self-realization and of, if I may say so, devotion to the divine. And every one of those paths is valid. So today, for example, we are seeing a situation in which a country where the minorities have come down from 38% to less than 1% is lecturing about India, a country where you have 250 million people who are minorities, and who are talking about genocide in India. I mean, when in their own country, if you turn the spotlight, from 38% to 1%, I think in some respects, that meets the classic definition of genocide. So I would only like to say that I think it is very important to forget this belief that only one set of people is being persecuted by another set of people or whatever. Across India, for example, in different locations, different types of persecution are going on. I mean, fortunately, because of the rise of the internet, because of the smartphone, because of the ability to stream messages, a lot of that is now slowly shrinking. A lot of that counter-offensives are being taken. Locally, a lot of counter-offensives are being taken. But the reality is that there are multiple forms of persecution. So when you have a situation which some agencies spotlight only certain specific phobias, I think it creates a problem. Now, in the United States, for example, there was a bill piloted by Representative Ilhan Omar on Islamophobia. I am totally opposed to Islamophobia. And in fact, I know that, to some extent, I paid a personal price for this because I've suffered a lot for my views on the fact that the Muslim community is modern and moderate. And, my mother converted to Islam. And frankly, for me, she was my mother. And I supported her completely in that. And there were some people who were not very happy with that. There were people who tried to tell her to say publicly that, no, I have reconverted. And finally, my advice to her, and I'm telling you this, was, okay, Amma, I'm sorry I can't be with you all the time because you're in Cochin, but then I have my other work. But if these people come and harass you, tell them, yes, okay, I'm reconverting, and get them off your, so they don't torture you and harass you anymore. And she said that occasionally, and then that became a very big controversy. But I know her mind. I mean, you know, and to the last days of my life, of her life, I would like to say, the day before she passed away, she told my wife and the wife of my sister-in-law, the wife of my youngest brother, don't burn me, bury me. She said it in Malayalam. I'm not going to repeat that. So what does she mean? She said, bury me, don't burn me. I went ahead and did that. And the amount of abuse I got was amazing, absolutely amazing. That kind of intolerant attitude does not sit well when you are talking about the need to tolerate or the intolerance in others. So I would like to say, Gargi, the best thing that we can do is for India to remain an example of tolerance, an example of acceptance, an example of inclusivity, where all forms of hate are treated with equal, if I may say so, condemnation, not just one form or the other. You cannot repeat the mistake of some groups treating one form of hate as horrible and the others as acceptable. Unfortunately, in India, for quite some time, past governments did that and created a reaction. And in some parts, that reaction have not been very pleasant. But, you know, but you cannot do that way. And if I may say so, they went too far. I'll give you an example. I'm saying this very openly because I've written this, I've said this very openly. I'm not going to hide it. In my personal view, this is a country which is partitioned on the basis of religion. You have about 1.1 billion Hindus. They have 3 holy places, Ayodhya, Kashi, and Mathura. Until they are returned to the stage that they were before, Aurangzeb destroyed them, I think you will have the danger of radical elements having a very growing role in the majority community. The best way of de-radicalization is to ensure that these 3 holy places come back. And let me end, Gargi, by one comment. You know, Sanskrit is a beautiful language, a very beautiful language. A lot of the epics were in Sanskrit. A lot of the texts were in Sanskrit. Do you know that almost nobody knew Sanskrit? Do you know that when did the Indian epics become known? It became known when Dara Shikoh, the son of Shah Jahan, translated all these epics from Sanskrit to Persian. And Persian was known by a huge number of Indians across the board, where Sanskrit was known only to a few and was not even taught beyond that few. So it took Dara Shikoh to translate epics into Persian for the epics to become known in India, to the Indian people in general. So I'd only like to say any form of trying to, keep knowledge in a very select bunch of people, keep what do I say, viability or whatever it is, or in a select bunch of people is wrong. All of us are equal. All of us have the right to knowledge. And the good thing about the internet, that dissemination has now taken place. You cannot have a situation anymore in which the knowledge of one particular language is restricted only to a particular group. And that is one of the reasons why India was so weak. And that is one of the reasons why much weaker groups were able to overcome so much in India. So again, Gargi, I'm sorry to point this out to you, but the reality is in India, for example, for substantial periods of history, only a particular set of people were allowed to fight. The rest of the population were not allowed to fight. And the rest of the population were about 92%. So only 8% were allowed to fight. 92% could not fight. And unless you have a people's army, unless you have a whole lot of people fighting for you, well, you're not going to have a strong army. Why did the Persians lose to the Greeks? They lost because the Greeks considered themselves free people. The Persian people who fought were slaves. So it doesn't matter whether we are slaves of Xerxes or we are slaves of Alexander or whoever, Cyrus. It doesn't matter, we are slaves anyway. So they had no motivation. Whereas the Greeks had a motivation. The Romans had a motivation to fight because they were independent. We have a motivation in India to fight. And we showed that at Galwan. Why? Because we are free people now. And I think it's very important, in my view, what we need to do is to ensure that we have a spirit of inclusivity, of tolerance, of acceptance throughout India. And that example, I can tell you, will be the best answer.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Next. Sorry, yeah, next question, Sri Kuttan.
Yeah, thank you, sir. It was a really wonderful lecture to listen to, and I really appreciate you for taking some of these points where you talked about inclusiveness and harmony and all. So, in light of the previous question, I would also like to ask you regarding the spotlight that some of these recent events have been getting in India, especially within the academic circles. For example, to give you a few, the hate speeches that have been going around, specifically calling for genocide and mass killings against minority communities. So this is one thing that has been relatively under discussed, and or in other words, not been taken proper action against by the authorities. And also we have an instance where the professor who predicted the Rwandan genocide, citing that those similar signs in India, where he said that a genocide could happen against Muslim community. So how do you think, sir, the academic community at large should approach this kind of cases?
Well, two things. One, when an individual was lynched, was murdered because he was supposed to have had a particular kind of meat inside his house, I said this is an act of terrorism, and the individuals who have done that lynching should be treated as terrorists and dealt with under terrorist law. In my view, any kind of an attack on an individual because of complete intolerance of the diet or dress or faith or lifestyle is an act of terrorism. And I'd like to see more such individuals brought before terrorist courts, not just criminal courts. Look, as far as the Muslim community is concerned, I'd like to say that that there are about 200 million Muslims in India, and 200 million Muslims in India, and frankly, if there is any killing of anybody, whether it's a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian or whoever, it's wrong. But to say that there is a genocide going on in India, and this particular gentleman seems to have, unfortunately, I don't know what he has done in the case of Rwanda. In this particular matter,
sorry, not like genocide has happened. Saying that signs of genocide, calls for genocide can happen in the future. That's what
in my view, that is not going to happen because our society is fundamentally moderate and it's not going to happen. I have faith in our people. I have faith in our society. Number one. Number two, forget 200 million people, even 20 million people. Can you commit a genocide against them? Is it realistic? Is it logical? It's impossible. So, these are some of the, things that are being said about our country, and I have written this all many times. The United States, efforts are being made to demonize India because India is a very important component of the battle for a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And I'd like India to become part of the battle for a more inclusive world also. And that is why there's a demonization of India. So yes, certainly acts of terrorism have been committed against the Muslim community. There's no question about it. One of them was the way this particular individual was lynched because he was supposed to be having a particular piece of meat. Well, in my view, whatever the diet you have is your personal thing. You should not have restrictions on that. Any kind of diet, anywhere in the world. But the reality is that, that this country is certainly nowhere near a genocide. And I don't know if this gentleman has ever come to India and traveled across India. And if he has, I remember once Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, I'm told she funded a certain study to check into reports of mass graves in India. And whole teams came and started digging up. And finally, they came across a collection of graves and I mean, the skeletons. And there was great jubilation. And it turned out they were the buffalo skeletons, not human skeletons. Look, this country is not a fascist state. This country is, there's no question of genocide. I mean, there's no question of genocide because we as Indian people will not permit it. Genocide has been taking place. There are countries where the minorities have shrunk. I'm sorry to say, even in Bangladesh, minorities have shrunk to about 10%, whereas they were much more than that. In Pakistan, they are now to about 1%, but certainly that is not going to happen in India. That's my assessment. So I think it's very important for us to have a clear reality check on that. Because what is happening is, by making this kind of allegation, we are essentially giving an escape route to people who commit hate crimes against people of of minority faiths. Oh, look, they're saying that India is a genocidal state. So they're trying to escape under that camouflage. Let's be clear. There is no such genocide happening in India. There are hate crimes, and in my view, crimes which involve that should be treated as terrorist actions. No matter what religion you belong to, you should be prosecuted as a terrorist.
All right. Next question by Janardhan.
Good morning, sir. Thank you so much for the lecture, sir. So my question is, you have mentioned about this global community coming together as a whole and trying to identify this de-radicalization efforts. But if you take efforts like countries like Russia and China, they have, I feel like they have, domestically, they are playing a different role in doing this things. And at a global level, I see a kind of, there is no genuine interest in countering these phenomena, sir. And the second question is, sir, like you said, we have to turn inward, sir. So when people turn inward and do and perceive this phenomena, I feel one's interest should be at a back end. So can you please talk a bit about that as well, sir? Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, Janardhan, that I would request you not to fall into this trap, the Western trap of conflating Russia and China. Frankly, the Western world is behaving as though the real problem they're facing is still Russia, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I would disagree that the Russians are promoting extremism. There is, I've written about the Sino-Wahhabi alliance, that there is an alliance between China and certain radical groups and things. And you know, from the Chinese point of view, communist point of view, it makes sense. If you have, for example, acts of terror across the world, once again, the attention of the world is diverted away from the efforts of China to control the Eurasian continent and the Indo-Pacific. So 9/11, before 9/11, George Bush was focusing on China. After 9/11, the focus shifted to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Middle East. So the Chinese are, I mean, certainly, shifting the focus away from their activities back to the Middle East and to terrorism would be quite, I mean, would certainly be a development that they may not regard as unwelcome. The Russians are different. Now you're seen in Central Asia, for example. You saw what's happened in a particular place in Central Asia, in a particular country. I wrote very clearly, this was an effort basically to install, through a color revolution, radical groups in power in that particular republic. And this was fought together with the Russians. All across Central Asia, Russia is standing against this kind of radicalization. And Russia and India are together in this. And here, Russia and China are not on the same page. So on this issue I can tell you, Russia and China are not on the same page. The reason why Russia is completely, on the same page as China is because of the Western strategy of ignoring China and focusing still on Russia. You look at the dialogue in the West, there's nothing about China. It's all the Russian bogey, the Russian threat. It's as though it's still the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union never entered and sent its huge armies into any part of Western Europe. But still, it's all about the Russian bogey. So I think from the Chinese point of view, they must be delighted that the focus is on Russia. So please, Russia and China are together in many ways. Unfortunately, in large part, that is because of the mistakes being made in the West. But I'm happy that a country like Germany, for example, lately seems to have understood that problem. And even the German army chief is, or naval chief, if I'm not, has clearly, possibly he did not know he was speaking, on the record or being recorded, but he has very correctly said that please be careful. Let's not push Russia completely into the Chinese sphere of influence. So where this kind of radicalism is concerned, then I can tell you in Central Asia, in India, I can tell you Russians are very clearly against it. Very, very clearly, where the Chinese, I'm sorry to say, in India at least, they have been actively promoting a certain country to our west of trying to create problems through extremism and radicalization. They have given that country a huge amount of assistance for that purpose. Assistance in technology, in communications, in money. And that is certainly not a friendly action by a country that I hope will understand it is much better to have a friendly India than any other kind, than an India which is made unhappy with you because of your activity. So Janardhan, I'm sorry, I don't think Russia and China are on the same page as far as radicalization of the kind that you are describing is concerned.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next question by...
Sorry, ma'am.
Yeah, sorry.
I think, sir, thank you, sir. Sir, you didn't answer the second part, sir. I was asking about, like you said, in countering de-radicalization efforts, we have to turn inward. And to really do so, I feel like these national interests should take a back seat to do so, sir. So can you throw some light on that, sir? To turn inward.
Janardhan, I can only say that, it's very difficult to define what the national interest is. De-radicalization is in our interest, but I would say de-radicalization, the broad sense that I am talking about, is very much in our interest, because if you don't de-radicalize in the broad sense, you are not going to succeed in de-radicalization in any narrow sense. So I'd like to make it very clear that this is a work in progress, frankly. And I'd like to see much greater efforts at bringing to book under anti-terrorism laws people who have killed people, people who have terrorized people on the grounds of a different set of beliefs or diet or lifestyle or the issues. I'm very happy Supreme Court, for example, has removed certain absurd colonial era laws against certain lifestyles. I'm glad the Supreme Court has done that. So the Supreme Court has also done something to try and some of the curbs on the internet that have been adopted have been removed. The fact is, a free, open, and inclusive society is needed. And from my point of view, it is a work in progress. I would like to say we are making progress as a people towards that, but it's a work in progress.
Yeah. Okay. Next question by Debashish Das.
Yes. Good afternoon, sir. This is Debashish Das. I am a PhD research scholar from Central University of Kerala, and I'm from the Department of International Relations and Geopolitics. It was a wonderful presentation. I would like to draw your attention to one of your statements that you have passed regarding the incident of deportation of Djokovic, the tennis player. So the context is that I would like to ask you, when we talk about, because you drag this issue in terms of radicalism. So the context is, when we talk about vaccine inequality around the world, where the Northern Hemisphere is having stockpiles of vaccines, different types of vaccines, and where the Southern Hemisphere are basically suffering from vaccine shortages. So we are talking about vaccine inequality. And at the same context, when you're supporting the statement, supporting the position of Djokovic, because you said that you do not support that the deportation was a valid thing. The fact is that in Serbia, And in most of the European countries, they are protesting now for their fundamental rights, like you said, whether to get vaccinated in terms of their own will, or it should not be imposed, right? But the thing is that when the Delta variant was there, we have seen lots of caseloads and deaths and everything. And that time, these sort of statements would not be, would not be considered valid. But now the problem is that in one hand, we are talking about vaccine inequality, and in the other hand, there are anti-vaccine protests around the world, Europe. So in the context of radicalism, how do you justify your statement? Because I don't see any scope over there, because people are getting vaccines there for free. They don't have to pay. Whereas in India, we have vaccines, we have no system as such, because people have to pay for certain vaccination at a very higher price. Whereas these people are really privileged, but they are, for themselves, they are not taking this vaccination. And on the other hand, the reality is that Djokovic was infected by COVID before joining the Australian Open. And in the visa application also, he has not declared that he was COVID infected. So basically, as for the process after the COVID infection, the person cannot get vaccinated for 3 months. And if there is a double jab, then after the first vaccination, he has to wait for another 2 months or probably 3 months to get the second vaccination. So it takes around 5 to 6 months to get the entire thing processed. So in that case, it is a very technical thing that he would miss the Australian Open. And on the other hand, Australian government did what they have done, would any country do, as a rational thing. So radicalism and rationalism, these are two different things. They do not go hand in hand.
Mr. Das, just allow me to interrupt here.
Yeah, please.
My wife was the individual who had this problem with penicillin, and she has not been vaccinated. She has traveled to the UK. We'll be traveling to the United States. Even though she is not vaccinated, she'll have certain protocols. But observing these protocols, she'll be allowed to travel there. I think that's a much more civilized way of doing it than forcing a person. Now, obviously, she's worried about a reaction. She had 2 reactions which almost killed her. She's terrified about getting a reaction from this. Now, I was double vaccinated. I got Delta. I know dozens of people who are double vaccinated who got Delta. So, from what you're talking, the implicit assumption is that if you have vaccination, you don't get Delta. Well, or if you're not vaccinated, you are in deep danger. My wife and I both had Delta, and we both recovered.
So sorry to interrupt you. I did not say that the vaccination should not be done, or the vaccine. If you get the vaccine, you do not have the, vulnerability to be attacked by COVID.
I would only put a very short point on what you said. First of all, I respect your views, and of course, these views have been said by the National Institute of Health, United States. These views have been said by WHO, and it's been said in a lot of places. One thing about this COVID pandemic is that it has once again taught us the inevitability of, unless everybody is safe, nobody is safe. And you're perfectly right that vaccine stocks being expired and being thrown away is an unconscionable act of some countries. Absolutely unconscionable. When so many hundreds of millions of people want the vaccine and are not getting it. So you're perfectly right on that. Either all of us are safe or none of us are safe. The same thing with de-radicalization. Either all of us are safe or none of us are safe. You can't confine de-radicalization to segments of a society or to a particular country. It's got to be across the board. You can't confine safety in COVID to segments of a society or a country. It's across the board. In the beginning, we had a lot of high-income people who got COVID because the flights brought COVID. Then when community transmission started, various income groups started getting it. So I'd like to point, number one, I respect your opinions. Number two, I'd only like to say that I have a different view on whether it was proper to ban Djokovic. I don't think under American law he'd be banned. As far as the British are concerned, my wife traveled to London some weeks ago and she came back and she was not vaccinated and she had no problem. So I'm not sure that the British would do that. The Australians have done that. That's fine. You agree with that? I don't. That's a different matter. But the important point is 2 points you raised that I agree completely with. One, it is ridiculous, unconscionable for countries to hoard vaccines and get them expired and countries to have no vaccines. And these countries are going to get that disease. And I'm sorry to say, the countries hoarding vaccines and the countries vaccinating left, right, and center, like Australia, 92% vaccination, and it's swimming in cases. So these countries are realizing it's either everybody's safe or nobody's safe. Second point, very clearly that you said, is very, very simple, and that is that we have to, in a sense, accept this fact about vaccines need to be generally distributed, and there has to be a system of vaccine. You have this COVAX program. India has been a very generous contributor to the COVAX program. We are again going to restart, but I'm very happy about Prime Minister Modi. I'm very happy in 2021, he refused to institute another national lockdown. There was immense pressure on PM Modi to institute a lockdown. He said no. I'm very happy that PM Modi made it very clear there will not be forcible vaccination in India. There will not be. If it's up to you, if you don't want the jab, you don't get the jab. There will not be forcible vaccination. So I'd like to say I support the Prime Minister, one, in avoiding a lockdown in 2021 and 2022, where you had a WHO and God knows what else, stampeding the world towards all kinds of lockdowns, which never helped very much, frankly. But again, that's something which WHO will not agree with. That's something with Dr. Fauci will not agree with. I'm sorry, I'm sure you will not agree with. But I'm happy that he avoided lockdowns in 2021 because I've seen the horrible damage caused to livelihoods and lives by the economic problems and consequences of some of the responses to COVID in terms of policy. So, and this year, announcing very clearly that he favors vaccination. I favor vaccination. I've had 2 jabs. I've repeatedly tried to persuade people who have not been vaccinated, please vaccinate. But I'm not going to say that I have the right to force them through coercive means to force them to be vaccinated. So I'm glad the Prime Minister made it very clear, despite advice to the contrary from some people, that no, there will be no coercion in India. Please vaccinate yourself, but if you don't, we are not going to come after you with punishment.
Okay, we have another question. Devansh Kaushik. Devansh, go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Thank you for your lecture. Sir, my question is regarding, of course, radicalization. Sir, how one should focus, or any country or organization must focus on the people who have the skin in the game in radicalization. Like we have seen, arms race is there. So in order to support terrorism, people are investing in that. Same goes with the pharma lobbies for vaccination processes. Some are making it mandatory, some are not. So about all these things. So how can we focus on these people? How should we deal with them? And continuing with this, the same thing, I want to ask you that, is radicalization, is it something to be managed or is it something to be eradicated? So this is my question, sir. Thank you.
That's a very good question. And the first point is, it's endemic. You're never going to stop it, but you have to manage it and it has to come within limits. And so I don't think it can be eradicated. And the second point is a very, very good question. And that is that the first line of defense is civil society, so the first line of defense is ensure a healthy attitude and atmosphere in civil society. An atmosphere, for example, which is there in academic life, of inquiry, of debate, of discussion. Now we have had a number of views being expressed here, which may not be the same. but that is healthy. That's important. So essentially, civil society, if we are talking about dealing with radicalization, the most important component is civil society. I've seen in the Punjab, for example, I've seen in Kashmir, the tip-offs about people who have come in from Pakistan or people who are trying to create violence, they've come from within civil society. Now, supposing civil society elements say, oh, it's not our concern, ye sarkar ki baat hai, they're not interested in that. It's only the government that should be involved. It's not. Ultimately, the next terror attack may involve you or your relatives or your friends. So the fact is, civil society is the first line of defense, and we need an alert civil society. And I want to point out here that we know, for example, the warning signs of different types of diseases. We have all been educated in the warning signs of COVID-19. Of course, 80% of cases are completely asymptomatic. There are no warning signs at all. That's a different matter, but one can claim credit for that. I mean, some pharma company is saying it's all because of us, but that 80% are not, but whatever. But the reality is that, we have to understand that civil society, and the best way of doing that is to ensure that we have justice to all and an inclusive society. As Prime Minister Modi says, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. It has to be Sabka Saath, because if you don't have Sabka Saath and Sabka Vikas, eventually you're going to have major problems. So I would again repeat what the Prime Minister is saying, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. And in each of us, we have to be inclusive. We have to accept different points of view. We have to, use methods of persuasion that are not coercive in trying to change minds. And where we cannot change minds, we cannot just condemn those people. And this is what is needed for us. So essentially, it's you and I that is the front line of defense against counter-radicalization. You, I, and 1.4 billion citizens of India.
Thank you, sir. Are there any more questions? I don't see any hands raised. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I think we can conclude the session here. So as a formal vote of thanks, I would like to thank you once again for agreeing to give this lecture. Hopefully we'll hear more of your lectures in the coming days, as I had mentioned to you already. So on behalf of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and UNESCO Peace Chair, which is held by Professor Nalapat, I would like to thank Professor Nalapat wholeheartedly for delivering this lecture to our students and also others who have joined the lecture. I would like to thank Dr. Ravindranathan, who was the in-charge head of the Department of Geopolitics. And I would like to thank all my other colleagues who have helped with the coordination of this event. And most importantly, the students and guests who joined and asked relevant questions regarding counter-radicalization and other issues pertaining to it. So thank you once again for joining.
Dhanasri, if I can just say something, I would not, I mean, it's not me, it's that's important. It's all of us. And the first point is, more than you're hearing from me, I'm sure that I'll be hearing from the students now, later, from you, from other colleagues, because I think it's so important that all of us know that we have got something important to contribute. I think, I'm very happy that so many of us are contributing to the public dialogue. So many of us are contributing to scientific journals, and I'm very certain we have a tradition in the department of giving self-confidence to the individuals who are in the department. Every single individual, no matter whether you're a first year or second year, no matter if you're a PhD student or a master's student, but the fact is, ultimately, I can tell you, each one of us, each one of you is capable of unique work. So my request is, just as you want to fight the radical element in you, bring out the very, very important element in you which can enable you to make a really good, substantial difference to all of us in this world. I know that's going to happen, and I'm privileged to have addressed all of you, and I'm delighted to hear this kind of questions. And I'm particularly happy that you have students who are basically, who have got different points of view, because through those multiplying points of view, you come to a conclusion. And that is the essence of Sanatan Dharma. Multiple paths, the same objective. And our objective has to be, if I may say so, a common humanity. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very
so
much.
much, sir.